It's amazing to me how geography and weather shape our lives. I mean, we're always talking to each other about whatever the weather is today. And certainly, if we live in a land of hills and valleys, as we do, I notice that every day when I get out to do my walk, I got the easy part that's going downhill and the hard part that's not. But we get acclimated to where we live, and we have become acclimated to a very lovely place. This territory of trees and mountains and lakes and the rivers. Mostly we're protected from the kind of hurricanes that hit the coast. They don't hit us as ferociously if we get the leftovers of them. It's not as cold and snowy here as it is in Fairbanks, Alaska, or Duluth, Minnesota in the winter. And it's not as hot as Miami or Las Vegas in the summer, thank goodness. And the Hebrew people, ancestors of the people of God, lived mostly in the plains and hills on either side of the Jordan River. The river runs north and south, and it's about 50 miles inward from the Mediterranean coast. That landscape was not just where they herded a few sheep and goats, but it's also where they planted wheat fields and orchards and vineyards for their sustenance. So they raised what they needed to support their lives. But if you read the Bible, you'll notice that the landscape often is the place, one kind of landscape or another, that gives a revelation from God of some kind, whether it's out in the desert or up on a high mountain like where Moses gets the Ten Commandments. And the produce of the land was taken to be a blessing of God on their country. So the religious experience of Israel's ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, is described in the narratives of Scripture and connected firmly with the landscape that sustained them in their days. So in today's reading from the Old Testament, we hear about Jacob. We hear a little bit about it and his family. He was the third Israelite patriarch, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, right? In today's lesson, he is old, but he is still alive. And by now he has had that famous dream in which he spent all night wrestling with God. And so he has another name. It's called Israel. It means he wrestles with God. Isn't that a great name? For not just one man, but for the whole people of God. God is someone with whom we wrestle during our lives. And Jacob thought that his son Joseph, who was the firstborn son of his favorite wife Rachel, the one he worked extra for, thought he was dead. He had disappeared when he was young. They thought he'd been killed by a wild beast. Jacob did anyway. But not everything had turned out badly. The story opens, there were 7 years of bounty going on in that part of the world. But the bounty in Jacob's piece of Canaan did not last. Canaan's countryside was suited for dry land farming when the weather was mild. But it all dried up when the weather was extreme. And so it was very vulnerable to a lack of rainfall. So when we hear there's going to be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of drought, 7 years is a long time to live without rain if your only source of water is rain. Pushes your survival to the brink, and it did for his family. Eventually, all those remaining sons of Jacob set out from Canaan, and headed for the nearest likely landscape to buy food. Now imagine that Middle Eastern landscape around the Mediterranean Sea. You're leaving Canaan over here, and you've got to find some land that's going to have rich, fertile soil, maybe with some water with it. Where's your most likely place to go? Down to the Egyptian Delta. The Nile River flows a long way. And by the time it gets to the end of the slope and hits the ocean, it's created a delta. A delta is just land that has been created out of silt, brought down from elsewhere by a big river. That's why there's a Mississippi Delta. And Louisiana Delta, it's the same one there. And there are deltas around the world, not a whole lot. And the one at the mouth of the Nile River is huge. And it's wonderful in terms of growing things. And so that's where they headed. It was the likeliest place they could go to find food if there was a drought up in the hills. Before Jacob's sons made the trip, Pharaoh had had a dream that disturbed him. And it was one that long lost Joseph was able to interpret because he had become Pharaoh's right-hand man. Joseph's insight was that there were going to be 7 fat years where there was plenty of food, and there would be 7 lean years that would eat up that food. And when Joseph came to that understanding, he used it to organize some preparedness. Because if we were going to have 7 good years and then 7 bad years, we need to do something with those 7 good years to make it through. And they needed to have enough grain to last those second 7 years. When famine hit then, Joseph was, as a surprise, reunited with those jealous brothers. They thought they'd never see him again. They got rid of him long ago. Remember why they wanted to get rid of him? Jealous. They were jealous, yeah. He was the favored son. He had this fancy long coat with long sleeves. How good a job could you do herding and gardening if you were wearing a long coat with beautiful sleeves and a decorated tunic? Not much. But he was always dreaming something and always telling somebody about it, and it mostly made the brothers mad. So when our lesson begins today, Joseph has already been down there. He's become an advisor to the Pharaoh, and his other brothers have been living up there east of the Nile Delta and north of it. And they have there a big camp of many children, many wives, and their good old father, Jacob. So when Joseph realized who this was in front of him trying to buy Egypt's wheat, he tested them, required him to bring the younger brother, Benjamin, also a favored son, back with them. And he revealed himself eventually to those brothers. By now, they are living down near the Nile Delta on the eastern side of it. On the southeast side of that delta. They're living there as resident aliens. They are shepherding flocks for the Egyptians, because the Egyptians don't like herders. Stay away from them. That way, Joseph thought they would be less likely to be seen as a threat by those Egyptians than if they moved in there and said, oh, well, we've got a right to this land too. And Egypt would not have put up with them. Now Father Jacob, Israel, eventually sees that Joseph is safe and that his huge family with its multiple generations can be reconciled. And they move into Egypt together, which is what Joseph thinks they need to do, as then old Father Jacob dies. He's seen his family all get back together. He's thrilled about it all, and they're living in Egypt. But once Jacob dies, the brothers get a little nervous. After all, they were the ones who had tried to kill Joseph off. They were the ones who sold him. And it was only by the grace of God that he had become this person of power. So they get nervous again, fearing that Joseph's going to turn on them now that the father's not there to keep everybody straightened out. At any turn in this story, Joseph could have turned the powers of Egypt against them. That would have destroyed their lives. And so desperately afraid again, the brothers beg for Joseph's forgiveness. But Joseph simply says, what do you mean? You think, am I God? Are you putting me in the place of God to forgive you? God does forgiveness and reconciliation of that kind. You chose your actions for evil purposes. But God was busy turning the whole situation into good, not just for us, but for everybody else. This family and this whole series of events was not about you, dear brothers. It wasn't just about what you did or didn't do. So have no fear. I'm going to take care of you and your little ones. I think the difference, at least one important difference, between Joseph and his brothers is that Joseph is very receptive to the hints God sends him through his longings, intuitions, dreams, images. If you remember, years ago, Joseph's father Jacob got his new name through a dream. He was wrestling with God all night long, and he was anxious because he was going home to brother Esau, whom he had tricked. He'd stolen his firstborn son inheritance from him, and 20-something years later, he's going back, and he's thinking, oh boy, what are we going to do when we meet up? So Jacob had been given a new name, and that same kind of intuition, that same kind of pay attention to what's going on with you inside seems to be something that Joseph has inherited. So we have wrestles with God as the father, and Joseph's name means increaser, or may he add to it. So we have two men who have been given names that are positive and they have possibility in them. So Joseph had added safety and work and reconciliation and forgiveness to his father's wrestles with God family. Like the Nile, God had used Joseph to increase the fertile ground from which the future of Jacob's nation could grow and bring new life. At least until that Pharaoh died and they could go back home, or the famine was over, or Joseph's contribution to Egypt's survival was forgotten. During the season of creation, we are looking at the role of creation and its health and its future, and there's a lot to think about. There's a science that's measuring how our actions are changing possibly the earth's soil, water, air, plants, animals, including us human beings. And we do need to pay attention to it. After all, God has given us brains to think and notice with. We are to help choose abundant life, not just for ourselves, but for everyone, the way Joseph's plan did that, not just for Egypt, for all the people that came to them. And our picture is very complicated. It's very detail-driven. It looks a little different in all parts of the world. At least for this English major, it does. Perhaps more difficult, though, are the personal, national, and international complications of any plan that any group of nations might propose. And like Joseph's brothers, we all tend to point the finger and say, no, you're wrong, and I'm right. You're wrong, and I'm right. And you're wrong, and I'm right. And where does that get us? Not wrestling with God, just wrestling with each other over and over. So can we possibly come to some conclusion about, well, what matters the most? Where do we start? Where do we beat things up a little bit? Where are our most endangered zones around this place? What sacrifices might we be willing to make to consider other people's lives, not just ours, as seriously as ours? Can we learn what we see in Joseph's responses to his situation? Because he doesn't engage in histrionics. He doesn't waste a lot of energy going, no, that's the wrong answer, shame and blame on you. He comes up with a concrete plan and he invests himself in it. And I believe God asks us to invest in each of us, for each of us to invest in the world we live in ways that will reap the possibilities of life here for everyone, not just for us. Something that might help the world flourish the way the Nile River does to the Delta. But then I'm also prompted to ask questions similar to Joseph's. Are we in the place of God? Are we the ones who have to figure all this out? Most of the time we don't understand our own actions, much less everything that God is doing. So how are we going to sort this all out truthfully, faithfully, lovingly, practically? I think one thing we have to do, one place we have to start, is to trust that what God is up to is always, always working for our good, not just ours, mine and my child's, or yours and your husband's, but what the whole world, what's good for all creation. Because God had said to that first creature he made, stay in this garden and tend it. Take care of it. And it seems like Joseph in our story that we've been reading is the only one attuned to God in this story, simply to trust that God will nudge him some way, will give him a way to use his own gifts and do God's good work by responding. How do you respond? How do you notice that God may be nudging you towards something? In your prayer life? In your dreams? Maybe in your awareness of our souls as we walk around this gorgeous earth and try to listen as Joseph listened. Maybe we don't have to come up with all the details that everybody agrees to all by ourselves. Maybe God might help us out. So we can practice noticing the movement of God in our own hearts and minds. We can ask God for direction and then listen to it and act upon it some way or other. We can listen to God not just with our calculating minds. Okay, that's going to take care of 57,000 people over here. What do I do with this 6 million over here? Those are important questions. But in listening to God, that's not the kind of thing God is often saying to us. It's more like, follow me. Or, what would I do? Or for us Christians, well, what would Jesus do? Because we are asked to act. We're asked to act and care for creation and all the lives within it. God gave us that charge. Take this garden and till it and keep it, God said to the earth creature. God has not asked us just to take others' ideas and practices as a curriculum or as a challenge. Not told us to point the finger of stupidity or guilt at each other, as if any one of us could have all the answers. But we can ask questions like, what if we, fill in the blank, or how could we, or how is this going to make our lives better? Open-ended questions so we can learn something, maybe see something new we hadn't seen before. And most importantly, I think, for us as people of faith, is to actively live that faith. That our God really is a God who wants to help us find a better way to deal with ourselves and creation and to work for everyone's good in that process. And so we have to open our eyes to more than just ourselves and our books and our experiments, as important as all that is. Listen to everything we can listen to. We need to open our hearts and hands up to the possibilities that might be just right in front of us. They may be a small one, like recycle your newspaper. Use a little less water. There are lots of things, maybe small, but they count. And if we can listen in that way, like the great rivers that bring new soil to the world's deltas, we can be used by God to help enrich some place for some amount of time. Plant ourselves so that there can be a grand harvest for everybody. I have a friend named Lou Parsons. She's a priest down in Ildewa. She and I were in the same class at Swanee, and so we graduated together. And when we were planning our joint service for the diaconate back in 2002, I asked Lou whether she had a preference about the music. And she said, well, you can choose anything you want, except that we have to sing How Firm a Foundation. How firm a foundation, he says of the Lord. You know that one? Well, I'm glad she said that, because it's not only one of my favorite hymns, there's a particular verse in it that's always been appropriate to me, particularly in hard times. It goes like, verse 3, it goes like this: when through the deep waters I call thee to go, the rivers of woe shall not thee o'erflow. For I will be with thee, thy troubles to bless, and sanctify to thee thy deepest distress. Sanctify to thee thy deepest distress. The things that disturb us most, hurt our hearts, make us afraid, drive us sometimes to treat our brothers and sisters poorly. God is working to turn that into something that makes us more holy. And our part is to trust it, to wait for it, to watch for it, to notice how we're different on the other side of a hard time than we were before we were almost drowned in it. I think God works by making our deepest rivers of woe into a Nile of some sort. To build up a new piece of fertile delta in our lives. Blessing troubles we don't begin to understand, transforming us in our deep distress into something new and holy that we couldn't imagine before. Showing us something that we could have never dreamed up ourselves. So trust God's intent, I think, is a great place to start. And then we have to be willing to watch for that and to respond, to get busy turning that into the right kind of Nile River, if you will. Look at what's right in front of us and flow with it and see where we can make a garden. And that means go wherever the Lord